In this episode of Cosmic Sponge, recent scientific discoveries bring us closer to putting chips into our heads to replace the cell phones in our pockets. A black-eyed child terrorizes campers in a dense forest. And for our main topic, we go back to ancient Greece to examine the dialogs written by the philosopher Plato, which contains the only historical reference to the lost city of Atlantis. Then we speculate on where such a city might be located, using only the best sources. Don't have as your main source material Atlantis, The Lost Empire by Disney, starring National Treasure Michael J. Fox.
Yeah. Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the podcast where we discuss weird wonders in the world. I'm Stephen Hall.
And I'm Jimmy Cole.
In this episode, we are looking at the legend of the lost continent of Atlantis. Was it a real place and sunk underneath the waves over 11,000 years ago? Or is it just an allegory, something that Plato used in his writings to prove a point, as most scholars believe? Well, we're going to dig into that and try to sort all of that out. But before we get into that, Jimmy, what you been up to this week?
I've been checking out advances in science because I'm afraid the AI people are going to take over and kill us all.
AI people? You mean just the singularity, right? The AI?
Yeah, well, I'm calling them people just so that I get on their good side. So maybe they'll spare me, our AI overlords.
Yeah, well, you haven't been very nice to our possible AI overlords. Are we getting closer to that now, so you're going to start being a little nicer?
Oh, heck yes. So what I think is going on, and most people would agree, that China and the United States are in this all-out race to get to the general AI. That's not really a good idea, I think, but Elon Musk had a really good idea. If you can't beat them, join them. So he created a company called Neuralink, and Neuralink is trying to figure out a way to interface humans and technology together. So you wouldn't have a cell phone anymore. It would just be built into your head. And that way you could integrate more easily with the machines when they take over. So that's the plan. Now, another company, or not company, but a group of scientists have made a discovery that they can now monitor and get information from neurons that is not electrical, but based on light. So this gives them the ability to do way more than what Elon's doing, because Elon's doing electrical impulses. That's my understanding. And this new company has found a way to do it by monitoring light impulses. So that, coupled with this other technological find where this one guy has a plastic that he built that actually is conductive, and it makes no sense, and they're trying to figure out how it works because it shouldn't work. So between those two technologies, we're getting a step closer. And I'm really excited to see what it's going to look like once the AI overlords take over.
So you're going to have a phone implanted in your head? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not going to have a phone implanted in my head. I'm going to have a computer planted. We call it a phone.
Well,
it's a computer. I'm going to have a computer planted in my head. That way I can talk directly to our AI overlords.
It'll know what you're thinking.
I'm just going to become a node on its big old motherboard.
Okay. Any idea when that might happen?
No. Singularity could happen tomorrow. I doubt it.
We'll have to keep our eyes and our ears open for that one. I have a story from the UK. This comes to us from The Mirror, who are always good for a good creepy story. Mm-hmm. Two teenagers, creepy encounter with a black-eyed child, encircled their tent before vanishing. Yeah, black-eyed child. Have you ever heard about these? These are a cryptid or an entity that some people report.
No.
These like ghostly children that have the huge black eyes.
Oh, no. I thought those were some kind of hybrid experiment out of a lab in Kyrgyzstan.
Maybe it is. I don't know. The young couple claimed a ghostly girl encircled their tent while giggling and moving in ways humans simply can't move to hide behind trees. There have been other sightings of her around Cannock Chase since the 1980s. While some dismiss the claims, others believe it is the tormented soul of a young girl who was murdered in the area during the 1960s. And some are even convinced it is an alien or a demon. Kylie and Ben say they saw the ghoul in Birches Valley during the summer of 2021. The two teenagers, whose names have been changed to protect their identity, had been separated due to the COVID pandemic, but decided to camp illegally together in the middle of the forest.
Wonder what they were doing.
The youngsters, who were 17 at the time, recounted their ordeal to supernatural investigator and author Lee Brickley. Their tale is featured in his new book, Haunted Hancock Chase, True Ghost Stories from the UK's Spookiest Location. It was around midnight when the teens heard something moving outside their tent. Thinking it could be a deer, they remained still and quiet, not wishing to spook it. But when they realized they could hear footsteps, they unzipped the tent to take a peek. Both campers heard the sound of a small child giggling, so they turned on their torches, lighting up the dark woodland to try and find the source. Ben spotted it first, running from tree to tree, hiding itself behind trunks and occasionally peering out towards the couple before finally stepping out into the clearing in front of them. Kylie said, "I was absolutely terrified. I'd read stories in the news about the black-eyed child, but it wasn't until the thing stood right in front of me that I could quite believe them. I knew instantly that we were dealing with the real thing because it moved in ways humans simply can't move. It was like it could teleport from one place to another when it was moving around and hiding behind the trees." Ben added, "I was shining my torch right at her, and she just stood there staring at us with her head slightly dipped. That's when the giggling started to get louder and louder. It really sounded like it was coming from all around us, even though I could see she was right in front of us. It was really disorienting for a few seconds. Then she bent down for a moment as if adjusting her shoes, stood back up, and ran off down a nearby path through a dense section of trees. The frightening pair huddled together in their tent, waiting for the sun to rise. When they came outdoors at 7 a.m., they found piles of stones evenly spaced around the perimeter of their tent and strange stick formations hanging from the trees, which looked like dream catchers. Slightly shaken, they packed up and started the 15-minute walk back to Ben's car. Suddenly, Kylie spotted a small child with black eyes peering back at her from behind an oak tree and screamed. Ben said he shouted, "Leave us alone," as the pair ran off towards his vehicle. The author Lee Brickley has been looking into the spooky goings-on at Hancock Chase for the last decade and has released 4 books about his findings. He believes he had his own encounter with the black-eyed child in Birches Valley back in April of 2018. Lee said, "She appeared about 100 meters in front of me. She stared right at me for about 30 seconds, then vanished without a trace." He also claims to have witnessed someone in an old soldier's uniform walk into the German war cemetery, only follow them inside and discover they had disappeared. "I believe the woods are haunted with many spirits of the dead, but there are lots of monster sightings that happen here, and I think those creatures come from another, much darker place."
Yeah, well, I can tell you, I saw this YouTube video of this mother had set up a camera, and she put this scary, spooky-looking doll in the middle of the hallway floor, and it was a T intersection, and 2 kids come walking by, and they're young. They're probably like, I want to guess probably like 5 and 7. And they're walking by, and the first one sees this doll because they turn the corner and they're coming down the hallway, and they see the doll and they stop. And the one screams and runs back, but the one in the back, the younger one, the 5-year-old, runs up as fast as he can and kicks that doll in the face, kicks it down the thing. So I think there are 2 kinds of people that are out in the world. Most people will be scared in a situation like that. But then you've got some people who just attack. And I would not doubt if one day, if there's a physical entity there that's playing a prank on people,
going to get kicked in the face.
The news story for the next day is going to read, "Young girl assaulted, kicked in face by scared boy," and she's going to have no one to blame but herself. I'm just saying.
Yeah, maybe so. Those black-eyed children reports, though, are very creepy to me.
Yeah, it would be creepy to me if I saw one, but I've never seen one. So, I mean, regular kids creep me out sometimes.
Well, all right. Guess it's time to move on to our main topic. But before we do, I'd like to remind everyone to please rate and review the podcast. It helps other people find the show. Look for us on Instagram and Facebook. In fact, you can read about the Black-Eyed Child, along with a few other things that I post from time to time, right there on Facebook. And we have a group called Cosmic Sponge Theorist as well. Check out our webpage, cosmicsponge.com. There you can find the web store and ways to support the show. If you choose to do Patreon, you gain access to another show we do called Weird Wonders that we produce exclusively for our Patreon supporters. Our contact information is firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. All right. Well, Jimmy, I know you've done a little legwork on Atlantis, or maybe a little arm work as well. I'm not sure. This is a big topic.
It is a little hard to come up with something that really captured this story and tied it in from past to present and future.
Doing this research this past week, and the article I read said that there had been 75 books published in the past 2 years on the subject of Atlantis.
Nice.
It's going to be difficult to squeeze in everything, but we're going to try and do a broad overview here.
Yeah, so let's just jump into it with this story that true, which is bizarre, and should capture the essence of the modern Atlantis story. The Brotherhood of Destruction prepared to pour concrete over the pyramid-shaped skyscraper of bodies. The year was 1980, and things got weird. The Trix Rabbit ate his own cereal for only the second time since first coming onto the scene in 1955. The nation elected a Californian actor who retired after slapping Angie Dickinson in the face. A biologist discovered and named a new species of iguana after watching an incest film that was a box office hit. Luke discovered Darth was his father. Saddam Hussein was awarded the key to Detroit. Puck-Man was changed to Pac-Man to prevent vandals from swapping the P with the F. John Lennon, John Bonham, and Bon Scott all died, and then somebody went off and shot JR. All of that is true, well, except for the concrete-covered body pyramids. That part comes from a science fiction story penned by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a writer whose fame rests primarily on 3 of his novels written in the late 1800s. While his third book, a futuristic tale of class warfare and a dystopian landscape covered in human pyramids, is an easy fit into the actual events of 1980, it is his first novel which earned him lasting acclaim, as it is almost single-handedly is responsible for bringing the Atlantis mythos into the 20th century, culminating in the History Channel's continued efforts to lampoon its own name. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, was an instant hit, using red yarn and a conspiratorial mind to weave a tale anchored in the facts of the day, strung together by the imagination of an active Irish lawyer turned farmer, politician, newspaperman, author, and ultimately Shakespeare denier. This work would lay the foundation from which much of the modern Atlantis mythos arose. And while, yes, Ignatius bounces from wild speculation to a restructuring of recorded history, it is possible some of the ideas put forth have merit, if even a little bit. Let's start with Plato and the origin of the Atlantean story, then look at evidence which supports Atlantis as a real place, and then the evidence which suggests it's nothing more than a myth before we speculate where reality and the Atlantean story meet. Steve?
Yeah, let's just let's go straight to Plato. That's where this legend comes from. He wrote 2 dialogs, Timaeus and Critias. This is the only source from the ancient world that ever mentions Atlantis. Every other reference of Atlantis comes from writers referencing Plato's mentioning of Atlantis. In Jimmy's intro, he mentioned the Donnelly story. Donnelly published this book in 1882 called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And this, in the 19th century, got people thinking about Atlantis and how it could be a real place. And we've all seen History Channel documentaries, all kinds of documentaries about Atlantis. I mean, I've seen, I don't know how many through my life. I mean, since the 70s onward, there's always something about Atlantis on there. But I had never read the dialogue before. I mean, they always, in the shows, they always reference a few things. But luckily, the Donnelly book actually has the entire dialogues. And it was pretty neat reading. I mean, obviously, they are translated into English, and I'm not sure what version it is. I mean, there could be some little details that are different now from ancient Greece. Both of the dialogues have four people that appear in the two dialogues: Critias, Hermocrates, Socrates, and Timaeus, obviously. In Timaeus, the first dialogue, he just really talks about the creation of the world, the structure of the universe, and ancient civilizations. Then in the introduction, Socrates muses about a perfect society such as one described in Plato's Republic, and wonders if he and his guests might recollect a story which exemplifies such a society. So then Critias mentions a tale that is considered to be historical and that would make a perfect example. And in his story, in the next dialogue, it's where the description of Atlantis comes from. What happens is there's an old couple that live on this continent or this large island in the Atlantic Ocean. Poseidon eyes their daughter, marries her, Plato, the daughter, and bore him 5 pairs of male twins. The eldest of these was Atlas, made the rightful king of the entire island, and then all of the rest of the brothers were given different areas of the land. So the description of the island is Poseidon carved a mountain where him and his love dwelt into a palace and enclosed it with 3 circular moats of increasing width, varying from 1 to 3 stratia, and separated by rings of land proportional in size. The Atlanteans then built bridges northward from the mountain, making a route to the rest of the island. They dug a great canal to the sea, and alongside the bridges carved tunnels into the rings of rock so that ships could pass into the city around the mountain. They carved docks from the rock walls of the moats. Every passage to the city was guarded by gates and towers. A wall surrounded each ring of the city. The walls were constructed of red, white, and black rock quarried from moats and were covered with brass, tin, and other precious metals. There's even more description, a great plain in the island. And so the big thing is the rings and the moats. That's the big description of it, and the towers and the temples. And they all get together every 5 or 6 years and have this sort of have their grievances aired out, and everyone passes judgment. And it sounds really good, like almost a utopian type society where everyone gets along. But then near the end of the dialogue, it says that they start getting greedy and not getting along as well, and start, I guess, wanting each other's wealth and turning mean in spirit in their hearts. And at the very end of the story, Zeus gathers up all of the other gods and goddesses, and I guess it's going to have a powwow with them to do something about it. And that's where the story ends. In fact, it abruptly ends there with Zeus getting ready to enact some kind of plan to punish the Atlanteans, or who knows, whatever. But that's it. That's all we have. And what we really have is this large description of the island. And before we get to that, it's related that Solon, who was an ancestor of Plato, that this story was related to him from an Egyptian priest, explained that Atlantis had sunk. At that time, the Atlantic Ocean, they said, was navigable. But then after Atlantis sunk, there was all this mud, and apparently ships could not pass through the Atlantic Ocean after that. So for whatever reason, they said at that time, the Atlantic Ocean was habitable or navigable, and now it's not.
Yeah.
Because of all this deep mud. And then one thing, too, when I read that, there is nowhere in the story that says anything about an advanced civilization or that they were farther along than anyone else technologically. I'm not quite sure where that has come from. They mentioned their ships or triremes, that they could sail under the bridges, and the moats were like 3 triremes wide or something. I remember reading that. That was a common ship at the time. So I'm not sure where the belief that the Atlantis people were so far advanced than the rest of the world. But that's it. I mean, there's really very little to this story that has brought this legend to life, and in a lot of people's minds most certainly exists.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to just reiterate, and you did a good job covering everything there, is the game of telephone that goes on here when recounting the story, because it starts with Critias saying, "I learned this from my grandfather, who was also named Critias, And he supposedly learned it from his father, who was Dropidas, and then he supposedly learned the story from his friend, the famous lawgiver Solon, who supposedly learned it from an Egyptian priest who supposedly read about it in their 9,000-year-old records. So this is how we get this story from Critias in the second dialogue of Plato, through a game of telephone, which I found fun. Yeah, well, they did say it was a great and wonderful empire. So, I mean, yeah, I guess you could glean from that it was advanced. I mean, they were powerful, and they had spread out across the rest of the world at that time. So, I mean, they technologically were probably superior. I guess you could glean that from it. And the other thing, while I was reading about the Plato account, was that Plato was originally, after he wrote the dialogs, those dialogues were copied by hand for quite a long time before they actually made it into a more rigorous copying process. So how much of that changed from the original writings to the writings we have now is uncertain. And then, like Stephen said, there were intended to be 3 dialogues that covered this topic. The first, which was written, Timaeus, and the second, which was Critias, and the last part of that is missing. And then the third one that was supposed to be produced was going to be Hermocrates. So it's named after 3 of the 4 characters in the dialogues. The dialogue contained 4 characters, Socrates, and then 3 others, Timaeus, Critias, and Hermocrates. The third one was never written because, of course, Plato passes away before he's able to finish it. Likely, Plato used literary influences of his days and events of his days when writing this story. For example, the Greek city-state of Syracuse in Sicily plays a bit of a resemblance to his descriptions of some of Atlantis, and he had shortly visited there before writing Timaeus and Critias. Likewise, the story of Atlantis' downfall may align with the war that Athens waged against Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Then we have also the destruction of Helike in 373 BC by an earthquake and a tsunami, both events of which happened in Plato's lifetime, and certainly he was aware of. Now we have our platform from which we can leap. We have Plato describing Atlantis, and the question now that we have to bring to bear, unless you have something more about the origins of Atlantis, is it a real place? Did it really exist? If it did, what proof do we have in history and in recent research that supports that a place like Atlantis actually existed?
And the Donnelly book that we talked about earlier just said renewed public interest in the late 19th century. And in his book, he believed that Atlantis existed where the modern Azores are now. The Azore Islands were all that was left of Atlantis after it sank into the ocean. He spends a lot of time showing examples of what geologists knew in those days about there were certain parts of the world that were underwater. You know, we find marine fossils. I mean, even in the 1880s, marine fossils had been found in mountains. The only thing is in his day, they didn't understand plate tectonics. He basically looks at the evidence that water had covered parts of the earth at sometimes and deduced that parts of the earth had been underwater because they sank underwater for whatever reason, but you know, with earthquakes and volcanoes causing it, and then at other times that land masses would rise above water. But in his day, he had no idea that plate tectonics come into play, and that's why we actually see marine fossils in mountains.
Yeah, you know, I want to actually go all the way back to Greece and see if we can find a suitable candidate for Atlantis based on what Plato recounted in Critias and his other work. Let's start with probably the most notable landmark and the one that everyone points to is the Pillars of Hercules. Now, I wasn't aware that the Pillars of Hercules was a geographic structure which moved based on what time in history you're talking about. Or at least this appears to be the case. A lot of historians think that the strait between Sicily and Italy, that was the Pillars of Hercules. And one candidate, which has been put forth, is Sardinia. And one of the reasons why Sardinia is put into the running is because there are structures on Sardinia which match, to some degree, the descriptions in Plato's works. So there is a mountaintop. It does have the foundations of a temple on it. The temple certainly fits the description of the temple described in Plato's work, though nothing but the base is left. There are a few things that you may have a problem with because from where that temple was located, you had these circular moats extending out. You have a moat and then another piece of land, a moat, another piece of land, and then the harbor. Maybe 9,000 years ago, parts of that land that's now surfaced was covered in water.
Any other evidence for Sardinia being Atlantis?
Yeah, so there's a description of 3 different types of stones that are described in Plato's work. A blue stone, yellow stone, and white stone, I think, talking about the architecture of the buildings and stuff. And on that island, they have 3 different types of stone that meet that criteria, that are prominent. Now, I don't think it's exclusive to Sardinia, but we'll get to that in a minute.
And I know traditionally the pillars of Heracles or Hercules are the Strait of Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean meet. You sail past the Strait of Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar, and you enter the Atlantic Ocean. Most sources believe that to be the Pillars of Hercules.
Right, and that's probably why that's probably the number one reason why no one considers anything within the Mediterranean as Atlantis, because it would have to be beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond Gibraltar.
And I know I've seen many documentaries on Atlantis, and one of them I saw thought the ancient Minoan civilization on the island of Santorini was a good candidate for the legend of Atlantis. This civilization began around 3500 BC, would have been flourishing long before Plato's time, so it would have seemed even an ancient civilization in their eyes. It was on the island of Crete and some of the other islands, but whenever you look at the island of Santorini, was destroyed by a volcano. This led to the decline of the Minoan civilization. This eruption on the island of Thera in those days, but is today modern-day Santorini, occurred somewhere between 1550 and 1500 BC. One of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history. Along with that volcano, which destroyed the island. I mean, now there's just this ring where the volcano used to be with remnants of the island surrounding water. There would have been a massive tsunami that would have covered Crete and many of the Aegean islands that the Minoans had settled. Another couple of reasons, there's a lot of images of bulls in their artwork, and so in Plato's dialogs, they sacrifice bulls. So they think there may be a connection there because that's mentioned that they release like 16 bulls, and then they go out and capture one and sacrifice it to Poseidon. We see the bull in the Minoan artwork. And also the colors, some of the colors that were talked about are also reflected in some of their temples. And they met a terrible end, especially on the volcanic islands and the tsunamis that followed them up, certainly could be looked at as the island sank.
Yeah, so this happened 1,200 years before Plato. Now, so there's a lot of interesting things here with what is essentially Santorini, and adjacent to it is a thing called the Cyclades Plateau. I think I'm saying that correctly. The Cycladic Plateau has a lot of things going for it. One, it meets some of the measurements Plato gives for Atlantis. 552 square kilometers essentially was ballpark for Plato's own dimensions. A description of Santorini or Thera has a single opening prior to the eruption on the island that meets the description of the citadel for Atlantis. And 9,600 years ago, that was all above water, 120 meters or something like that. The sea level was lower. All that was above, and there was a valley, and there were these peaks that made up this section of geography, which really does meet a lot of the criteria for what he's describing. Now, when Santorini blew up, it impacted all of the bordering nations around the Mediterranean, including Egypt. So certainly, Egypt would have recorded that event in their documents, as well as many of the other nations around the Mediterranean. So It's my favorite for at least informing some of the story and some of the description of Atlantis that Plato included in his dialogue.
And it would have been in ancient times for Plato. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're talking over 1,000 years prior to them existing. So that would have been legendary by their times. These legendary volcano that exploded and spewed all this ash and destroyed the island and most of this civilization. The massive tsunamis that undoubtedly inundated all of these island cultures, all of these coastal cities and towns, would have been a major catastrophe in the ancient world.
Yeah, the largest volcanic eruption that had happened in modern being, in recorded human history. So in the last 9,000 to 11,000 years. And certainly sea levels have risen quite a bit since then. And so it's very possible much of this that's underwater is Atlantis underwater. So this is my favorite, but there are others that people have supposed are the location of Atlantis. A lot of others. Is there any that your favorite?
The Minoan civilization is my favorite. I don't think it was ever truly Atlantis. I think that it was the inspiration for Plato to create this Atlantis in his story. This was sort of the real event that gave inspiration to it, an ancient civilization that disappeared, covered up in water, volcano, earthquakes, all the rest of it. But I don't think he was specifically meaning the Minoan civilization. I think he created Atlantis, just as we spoke of earlier. I think they were trying to show, here's a civilization that's ruled by kings and have turned mean and greedy, and we're going to pit it against our perfect republic. Our society's better than their society. That's why we're going to prevail. Even though the story is left unfinished, you get the idea that there was this great heroic battle fought between the Republicans and the kings.
And the Democrats.
Don't say that.
Well, I mean, really, okay, do you think that Plato would have made up stories in his stories?
I mean, that was pretty common too. I mean, in fact, a lot of that was not uncommon in Greek times, and even through the Renaissance. I think about Galileo. I mean, of course, that was many years later, but Galileo, it's common to write a story of 3 or 4 people having a conversation to explore an idea and an opposing idea. So if I have a new idea that the sun is actually the center of my solar system, I'm going to write a story about these 3 guys having a conversation about it, not writing it as a documentary or a factual book as we would do it today.
Yeah, and so I looked this up. I was like, was this really his shtick? Did he go around? And you're right. Was it his shtick to make up things in his story? And this was, like you said, the norm, and particularly for Plato, because Plato, in his heart of hearts, was a playwright. He fell into this other line of business after meeting Socrates. He starts telling these stories, and he has it, the Ring of Gyges, which is in the Republic. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then the Allegory of the Cave, which most people are familiar with, at least people who had to suffer through the humanities in college, and the Myth of and so on. And in his symposium, he has a comic playwright character tell a hilarious fable about humans were originally hermaphrodites with 2 heads, 4 arms, and 4 legs, and then they tried to rebel against the gods, so that's when Zeus split them into 2 different people. And that's, again, a story that was made up to prove a point or to make the basis to launch a dialogue. And did this all the time, and why would Atlantis be any different?
I know when I read it finally and read the entire thing, and listeners, if you're interested in reading it and you have access to a Kindle, it's absolutely free. I looked it up and it costs nothing to get this book that Don Lee wrote. And in the beginning of it, it has the dialogue, obviously translated into English. It reads like a story. It doesn't read like a history book. Like, this is what Atlantis was. It reads like an ancient story. And other things that happen, for instance, the beginning of the story, or when they begin describing Atlantis, it's a land that was given to Poseidon. They all split up the earth, and he gets Atlantis. Has these children, Atlas being one of them. all the Atlanteans are descendants of Poseidon, who lives on the island with his mortal wife. At the end of the story, all the gods are gathering up because Zeus can see the malcontent, or can see the evil, I guess, in the hearts of the Atlanteans. So Zeus is getting all the gods and goddesses together to come up with a plan, and that's where the story ends. And so even when you read Donnelly, it says it's not full of all this mythology, but it is full of all this mythology. I mean, Poseidon's living on the island. All of his descendants are the ones that are the kings. It's very full of mythology.
Yeah, they're all on those islands. They're making tuna fish sandwiches. They're hanging out and they're plotting against the Athenians. It is a cruel sort of like ancient Dukes of Hazzards going on there.
But then some of the things that you can look at, and Donnelly points these out too. We had the Odyssey written by Homer and the Iliad. The Iliad's about Greece going to war with the city of Troy and besieging the city for 10 years and then using the Trojan horse to sneak inside the city and finally defeat the people of Troy. For years, scholars said this place did not exist, that Troy did not exist. It's all just a story written by Homer. And it's obvious that a lot of things in Homer are
made up fantastical myth.
The Harpies and the Cyclops and all those things. I mean, it's obviously mythology and just stories. And so scholars had always believed that Troy was just a fictitious place. But in 1871, there was Henrik Schillmann and Frank Calvert excavated a site of a classical area city under whose ruins they found the remains of numerous earlier settlements. And several of these layers resemble literary depictions of Troy. So they named it Troy, and then they're saying they're being justified. They looked for it where they thought the story said it was, and they found this city, which under several layers of cities built on top of other cities, probably because it's in a very active earthquake zone, that these cities had crumbled and then they built on top of them. But they're the ones that really called it Troy. There's no evidence that it was called Troy during its time. So maybe it was Troy, though. So then that's what leads people to now say, well, maybe there's really an Atlantis. And also Pompeii, we know exists. In 79 AD, the volcano in Italy, Mount Vesuvius, erupted and covered up Pompeii and Herculaneum, two cities that were completely covered by ash, and many people said were forgotten for hundreds of years until finally people dig up this town and they find this ancient Roman city that had disappeared, and they don't find it until over 1,000 years later and start digging it up. Even though it was legend, it was there, some people in historians said, no, it's not true, it never happened, no volcano ever covered up this Roman city, but it did. So that's what leads a lot of people to look at Atlantis as saying, okay, we have this big description, just like Troy, just like Pompeii, maybe this place really exists. Even though it is in a story and it is used as an allegory, maybe there really was an Atlantis that met some kind of doom.
That seems perfectly reasonable to me. Now, I was watching a documentary on Santorini, and it just blew me away because these people have flushable toilets. I'm not kidding. Flushable toilets. And we didn't get flushable toilets again until Romans, and then we lost it again, and you had the Dark Ages where people were pooping in the street in the stairwells, all the way until, I mean, even today, you go to Paris, are probably still pooping in the stairwells. And they said Philadelphia, and you could smell from, miles away because people just dropped their pants and pooped everywhere. Now we have flushable toilets again. So that's an advanced technology, man.
Does that mean our civilization's about to end now?
It might. You watch all of these things with asteroids and stuff. And matter of fact, that's the flood stories come from there, and the demise of Atlantis coincides, if that timeline hooks up, it coincides with this comet theory, of which there's increasing proof to support it. And matter of fact, they believe that it was part of the Taurids asteroids. Some of that may have played into this constant barraging. So it wasn't just a comet, it was this constant barraging of these meteoroids. And of course, the I think it was the Taurus meteoroids, which they call the Taurids.
There's a meteor shower. It comes out of the constellation of Taurus.
Right.
It's just like all meteor showers. It's the cometary fragments of a comet that passed through. We just had the Orion one.
Yeah, they name them after each one. I just found that out. So it's like if it comes from Gemini, it's called the Geoids, right?
Yeah, it's in the direction of that constellation.
Orids, Taurids.
Yeah, Orids, yeah.
Yeah. So you just pick a constellation and you have some come through.
Yeah, the Taurids, I'm not sure which one it is, which comet it is. I know the Orids is from Halley's Comet that passed through in 1986. And so that stream of debris is still in orbit around the sun, and we pass through it once a year. And when we do, all these grains of sand, ice, and tiny cometary fragments burn up in our atmosphere, and it makes for a nice meteor shower.
Or a destructive meteor shower.
Stars.
That could be the end of us. Right, the Tunguski event, in Siberia, they believe that is from one of those Taurid passings. Right. It knocked out 2,000 square miles of trees.
And I mean, right, and we talked about that on the ancient megafauna episode, disappearance of at the end of the last ice age.
So that probably wiped out Atlantis. I'm just saying, it's obvious.
Now, I mean, the timeline coincides. If this Plato says it was 9,000 years ago, that was over 2,000 years ago. So, yeah, we're talking 11,000, close to 12,000 years ago. That definitely coincides with the time of a cataclysm, or the beginning of the Younger Dryas, whenever we think possibly a comet hit the Earth. We know the climate got very cold again after this event, and that is also the time that most of the megafauna disappeared.
Yeah, so I'm not writing Atlantis off. Keeping it on my radar, man. Till James Cameron finds it. It's probably somewhere next to the Titanic.
Even if you found Atlantis, how would you know? How would you know it was Atlantis? Let's say
because
Atlantis
it says Atlantis, I was here. Somebody just write something on the walls or something. Atlantis rules. Atlantis 2021 or whatever. That'd be BC time. They'd have something written on the walls about it. Atlantis 12, Athens 3. They have the game scores.
Ever since I've been alive, every 3 or 4, 5 years, some diver somewhere says they found Atlantis, and it makes headlines. I mean, in the last one that I'm aware of happened in 2018. Are you familiar with this one?
I watched that documentary earlier today. It's actually what caught my eye was James Cameron was associated with it. And they believe it was just past the Straits of Gibraltar off the coast of Spain. Actually, on the coast of Spain and off the coast of Spain. They dove and they found some old anchors.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. If you dive anywhere in that part of the world, you're going to find two things: fish and old anchors. But in their defense, the geography is not too bad. It's ballpark for some of the description.
This article that I have right here is from November of 2018. It goes into a little bit about Plato's writings and Atlantis maybe just being an allegory, but that a lot of people believe that it happened, that it was a real place. There's an English surveying team called Merlin Burrows. So this company is based in North Yorkshire, England, and uses historical records and satellite data to find archaeological sites.
Technology.
Yeah, they use some of the land stats. That's also what provides the data for Google Earth.
A survey company named Merlin something or another that's named after like somebody's dog or
Merlin Burrows.
Or a poorly dressed wizard. Merlin Burrows. Okay. It's a southern wizard.
So Blackburn, that's who is the CEO of Merlin Burrows.
That's not sinister at all.
The company's researchers chose to look at the site in Spain after reading Plato's 2 dialogs on Atlantis. They also looked at another text, but Blackburn won't say which one.
Oh, yeah, I read this article.
We won't share that in a public forum at this stage, Blackburn said. However, that he expects that the writing will be submitted for scrutiny in the fullness of time. They're using Plato's writings just like everyone else did, but he claims to have something else that he's not telling what it is.
You can find out by buying our book for only $19.95.
Yeah, something like that. And they had a big press conference that said they had found Atlantis. The team found several archaeological clues, large circles that were possibly the basis of the ancient towers, the ruins of what the team claimed to be the Temple of Poseidon, and a greenish-blue patina coating some of the ruins. It said that was some of the details included in Plato's dialogs. They also found the remains of a long seawall as well as signs of a tsunami, which could be evidence of a cataclysmic event that drowned the society. The Atlantis cities, which are very detailed in Plato's writings, are really there for everyone to see, Blackburn said. Next, they took samples of what most believe are likely human-made concrete from the circle-shaped foundations in possible temple ruins. The company gave these samples to a material analyst laboratory in Italy, which dated them between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, Blackburn said. However, by press time, Blackburn hadn't said which methods the laboratory used to date the concrete. And they, of course, they made a 2-hour documentary called Atlantica about the find. You said you saw it?
Yeah. You know how they got that concrete? They determined how old it was? They had Vicini P on it, and then they checked the collar against a palette of colors and said, oh, yeah, 10,000 years. It's some kind of pH test.
It says here, Blackburn said, what we really want to do is we want to franchise the find. We want to make an awful lot of money out of it, and with that money, we want to support the archaeological community.
Well, at least he's being somewhat honest.
Yeah. There is Juan Jose Valeris Robles, researcher, vice director of the Institute of Language, Literature, and Anthropology at the Center for Human and Social Sciences in Madrid. If the dating of the 10,000 to 12,000 year old concrete specimens reported by Berlin Meadows is accurate, then these samples could be from the pre-Holocene formations, he said. But at least for this location, that date doesn't match up with an Atlantis-type society. However, assuming the material was man-made, which is a big assumption, the date takes us from a culture history perspective down to Paleolithic and post-Paleolithic times, he told Live Science. An anthropologist, Feder, who was I think, a co-author of his and something else. So this anthropologist questioned why Merlin Burroughs hadn't submitted its findings to a peer-reviewed journal, which would give other scientists the chance to vet the research. He said, it immediately turns on my bullshit detector when somebody, instead of doing that, makes the announcement through a press release, a press conference, and a web page for a documentary.
Yeah. Remember the days when they had peer-reviewed papers?
So even at the time, they were questioning some of this. And then I found a follow-up article. It was written about a year later. This article was called How the Discovery of Atlantis Made Big News Then Faded Away. This writer said that, they followed up on this a year or two later, said, I loaded up on Google Earth, went to the location on the map, and spent about 20 minutes looking for the circles in the photos that accompanied the articles linked above, because they can tell you how the land was used recently, which can help you eliminate chasing wild goose features. And that's what Merlin Burroughs' team ended up with. The oval features they described were there, and they presented a very curious pattern. And there are two sets of these features. Clearly they have purpose and meaning in their design, but are they ancient? The edges are very crisp, not what you'd expect from features hundreds of years old, much less features over 10,000 years old. She found a paper in PLOS that described a biological study that began in 2004 at this location. The circles found by Merlin Burroughs were experimental ponds used in 2004 and 2005 to measure zooplankton dispersal rates and are located within this national park where, in fact, it's the actual site. So the 10,000-year-old curious tower, remnants of towers, these ovals and circles were zooplankton ponds from only 14 years before.
Okay, well, maybe do a little bit more research before your press conference.
Yeah, and I mean, there's other stuff. So I mean, we see this all the time. I mean, there's other evidence in this article. I don't want to dig into it too much, but that's my point. Even if you found Atlantis, I mean, if you found some buried city or some buried or if you found some underwater ruins now, it could be anything because the shorelines have changed so much in the past 2,000 or 3,000 years.
Yeah, I think this is a cautionary tale that if you're going to do research into Atlantis, Don't have as your main source material Atlantis, The Lost Empire by Disney, starring National Treasure Michael J. Fox.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe Atlantis was a real place, but just from what I've read, this research I've done, and read the actual dialogue myself, it feels like you're reading a story. To me, it doesn't feel like a historical account. Now, again, okay, look at the Iliad. Maybe they found Troy. That was a real place that probably was at war with Athens at one time, with Greece at one time. Maybe. But then there's a lot of other story in there that's obviously not true. If we want to look at Atlantis, I feel like the cataclysm that had happened over 1,000 years before Plato's time to the Minoan civilization was likely the source material, the inspiration for this story.
That's what I think. I think what he did is he crafted a story. He drew from a lot of things that he had heard or had read about or had experienced in his lifetime, brought it all together, constructed this story of Atlantis just as a mechanism to get his dialogue told the way he wanted to tell it.
Right. I mean, that's what most historians think. But who knows? Maybe there is an Atlantis under there somewhere. Yeah. But we've seen nearly all of the bottom of the oceans now. I mean, we can see what they look like on Google Earth, for that matter. And there's no hidden continent with all these ruins on it anywhere.
Well, I mean, at least that's what we're being told by the people in power.
Right.
Just saying.
And I mean, there's those, just like the comet theory you've brought up that seems to be gathering a lot of steam. I mean, there's a lot of belief that there was some ancient civilization. I mean, we have the ruins in Turkey.
Oh, Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
Right. That are believed to have been almost 12,000 years old. Before they were discovered, I guarantee no scholars would have believed that temple or those ruins would be found and to be that old. They would have probably said it was impossible, that people were hunter-gatherers then. They didn't have the resources or were not settled enough to build some kind of temple like this at that time. And yet, here we are. We have something like that. So maybe there are other discoveries yet to find that can tell a bigger picture about what did happen before the end of the last ice age. Maybe there were civilizations we don't know
Yeah,
about.
and that's why I follow people like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock and Michael J. Fox, just so that I can gather information from all corners of the world. Actually, if it's going to be corners, I need to add another person in there, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, to gather all this information and then, challenge the status quo, because, when we get into anthropology and history going back that far, they really could be wrong about a lot of stuff, and they've got to change the narrative that they've clung to for so long, because it almost feels at this point that, to some degree, they're taking the knowledge that they're getting, discarding some of it, and keeping that which fits the narrative they've already constructed.
But not always.
No, not always.
Those ruins,
but
those ruins, there's no denying that. Just like the footprints that were recently found in New Mexico that shows humans were in the Americas 22,000 years ago, when previously, based on some artifacts found of the Clovis people, archaeologists believe the Americas were settled something like 13 to 16,000 years ago. So now they've had to change that.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's evidence there, and I think science tries to follow the evidence. Too often, people want to connect a lot of dots and just create this huge story of things that we don't have evidence for, or take evidence from all kinds of different places and points and then try to connect the dots because some things are kind of similar, and create this story of a massive global civilization. I just don't think that's the case. I don't think we'll ever find that.
Well, I mean, people didn't think they'd find Göbekli Tepe, so.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, all right, man. Do you have anything you need to add on the Atlantis story?
No, I think that was just a really broad cover of it, because you could go down the weeds in this, because there's a lot of stuff we didn't cover. We didn't get to the Bimini Road. We didn't get to the thoughts about the Yucatan Peninsula and how that might have played into the story of Atlantis, or we didn't really go over, the Azure Plateau that's in the middle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So we could go into this, like you said, for hours and hours, but I think that's a really good overview of Atlantis. Maybe we'll revisit it at some time in the future.
Right. And I think that may be something we'll do. We'll look at one particular site that people think could be Atlantis, like the Minoan island of Santorini. So, maybe look at that sometime in more depth. But yeah, we could only really scratch the surface on this because of just such a broad topic. But anything you need to add tonight?
Nope, that's it.
All right.
Ready to get out of here?
Listeners, we appreciate you all downloading and listening to us again this week. Hope you enjoyed tonight's episode. This is Stephen Hawk signing out, and we'll see you next week.
And see, that's how I can tell you are just burned out. You are just tired. Because usually you say, and with that being said, this is Stephen Hawk.
Well, I usually do the whole,
Yeah, the whole...
don't forget to rate and review thing.
Yeah, but they already know that. Because they listen to us every week. And with that being said, this is Jimmy Coe saying, keep your eyes to the skies and your feet on the ground, and we'll see you next week.
The truth is, I got to pee.
Go pee.
So I'm out.
You're out. That's all for this week's episode of Cosmic Sponge. Please don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions or have a story you'd like to share, you can contact us using our email account at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. If you'd like to support the show, consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/cosmicsponge, where you get access to exclusive content, including our Weird Wonders, news, and stories released every week. To explore everything Cosmic Sponge has to offer, including other ways to support the show, head on over to our website at www.cosmicsponge.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.